my sister charged items to my credit card without asking. Yet my mother chose to blame me for the entire situation, ignoring my side of the story and holding me accountable. So I waited until... I never expected that phone call to change everything. "Your father, he passed away yesterday." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Dad was gone, and they waited until now to tell me. I gripped the edge of my desk, grateful that I had splurged on this downtown apartment with its private office space. "What happened?" I managed to ask. "Heart attack?" "He was at work," she said, her voice trailing off, and I could hear my sister Sarah's distinctive sobbing in the background. Of course he was at work. He was always working, trying to support them both, my unemployed mother and my 23-year-old sister who had never held a job in her life. I felt anger rising in my throat, but swallowed it down. Why wasn't I informed when it happened? "We were in shock," she paused. "The funeral is on Friday at 2 p.m. Will you come?" Would I come? He was my father, the only one who had supported me when I decided to move out and live on my own, the only one who had celebrated with me when I graduated from college while Mom and Sarah were too busy shopping for Sarah's prom dress, the only one who called me regularly, even if it meant sneaking away during his lunch break to do so. "Of course I'll be there," I said firmly. After hanging up, I sat there, staring at the city skyline through my window. All the times I was pushed aside, like when I made the debate team in high school but Mom skipped my first competition to take Sarah to her dance recital, or when I got my first job at 16, and instead of being proud, Mom complained that I wouldn't have time to help Sarah with her homework anymore. That's why I left as soon as I could, got myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, found an apartment in the city center, and worked my way up in the company. Dad understood. He would visit me when he could, always bringing small gifts and proud smiles. Now he was gone. The funeral home was packed with people I barely recognized, distant relatives, Dad's coworkers, old family friends. All of them gathered to say goodbye to the man who had worked himself to death at 54. I stood near the back, watching as people approached Mom and Sarah, who were stationed front and center, accepting condolences with tears streaming down their faces. "Oh, Margaret," Aunt Susan was saying to Mom, clutching her hand, "if you need anything at all." Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "It's going to be so hard without Richard. He was our only source of income. I don't know how we'll manage now." I felt my jaw clench. Sarah let out another dramatic sob, and 3 more relatives rushed to comfort her. I couldn't help but notice her perfectly styled hair and manicured nails. Apparently being unemployed had its perks. He worked so hard for us. Mom continued, her voice carrying across the room. "Now it's just me and Sarah with no income." I had to step outside for a moment. The cool air helped calm my rising anger. Dad had called me just 2 weeks ago, sounding more tired than usual. "Just finished my second shift," he'd said. "Got to keep the girls comfortable. You know." I should have said something then. Back inside, I endured 2 more hours of Mom's performance about their financial struggles, while Sarah played her part perfectly, looking helpless and devastated. Neither of them mentioned that they'd had years to find jobs of their own. Finally, the last guests were leaving. I was about to grab my coat when Mom called out, "Laura, wait, we need to talk." I followed them into the kitchen, where Mom suddenly turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Laura, I know things haven't been good between us. I know I ignored you, always favored Sarah, but your father's death has shown me how fragile life is. We need to put aside our differences and be a family again." I wanted to scream at her, tell her that Dad might still be alive if he hadn't worked double shifts to support their lazy lifestyle, that while I was building my career, they were living off his sweat and sacrifice. The words burned in my throat, but I swallowed them. This wasn't the time or place. Instead, I asked bluntly, "Why now, Mom? Is this about money?" Her face transformed into a mask of hurt. "How could you think that? Your father left us the house and some savings. We'll manage for now. I just want my daughter back. I'm not against reconciling," I said carefully, "but maybe we should take it slow, build trust gradually, of course." Dear Mom replied. "Whatever you think is best." The drive back to my apartment was a blur. As I pulled into the parking garage beneath my apartment, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. My mother's sudden change of heart didn't sit right with me. After years of indifference, she now wanted to rebuild our relationship. It was too convenient. And though she claimed they would manage for now, I knew their lifestyle. Sarah wasn't about to start working, and Mom had never held a steady job in her life. The moment the savings ran low, they'd come knocking. I stepped into my apartment, locking the door behind me, and tossed my coat onto the couch. The city skyline outside my window sparkled against the night, but I barely saw it. My thoughts were tangled in memories of Dad, of all the times I had wished for his freedom, wished that he would stop working himself into the grave for people who didn't appreciate him. Now it was too late. My phone buzzed on the counter. I hesitated before picking it up. Sarah, of course. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. Hello? Laura? She sniffled. Her voice was thick with tears, but something about it felt off, practiced. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I stayed silent. I know I wasn't a good sister. I know Mom always put me first, and I let her. Another shaky breath. I want to fix things between us. I leaned against the counter, rubbing my temple. Why now, Sarah? Because we're family. A pause. And because Mom's not okay. She's been crying all night. She doesn't know what to do without Dad. I think she's scared, Laura. I closed my eyes. Scared. Scared because the life she had built, one where Dad shouldered all responsibilities, had shattered overnight. Of course she was scared. She had never been forced to stand on her own. Laura, please, Sarah whispered. Come over tomorrow. We can talk. I exhaled slowly. Maybe part of me wanted to believe her, to think she actually wanted to mend our relationship. Maybe I owed it to Dad to at least try. Fine, I said finally. I'll come by in the afternoon. The relief in her voice was instant. Thank you, Laura. I'll see you then. I hung up, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. Something didn't feel right. I had spent my entire life being the afterthought, the one pushed aside while Sarah was the priority. Now suddenly I was important. I wasn't sure if I was walking into a genuine attempt at reconciliation or just another manipulation. But either way, I intended to find out. The next afternoon, I drove to my mother's house, my fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Modest homes with neatly trimmed lawns, cars parked in driveways, kids riding bikes down the sidewalks. It felt like stepping back into a place that had never truly been mine. I pulled up in front of the house, staring at the familiar blue shutters and the porch where Dad used to sit on warm evenings, sipping coffee after long shifts. Now it felt different, empty. I stepped out, inhaling deeply before making my way to the door. Before I could knock, Sarah opened it. She looked almost the same as she had at the funeral. Perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, but her eyes were slightly red, like she had actually been crying. Laura, she breathed, stepping aside. Come in. I hesitated before crossing the threshold. The house smelled the same, vanilla candles, fabric softener, but it felt colder. Mom was sitting on the couch wrapped in a cardigan, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me with watery eyes. Laura, she said, her voice cracking. Thank you for coming. I nodded, keeping my guard up. You wanted to talk. Sarah gestured toward the kitchen. Let's sit down. I followed them, my footsteps light on the wooden floor. The kitchen table was the same, oak, slightly scratched from years of use. I sat down across from them, folding my arms as Sarah poured tea into 3 mismatched cups. It was all too coordinated, as if they were playing roles. I know we haven't been the best family to you, Mom started, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her cup. I know I put Sarah first too often. I know I made you feel like you didn't matter. She sniffled, dabbing at her eyes. And I regret that more than anything. I studied her carefully, trying to decipher if there was real remorse beneath the performance. Okay, I said cautiously. And? She let out a shaky breath. I want to fix things. I want us to be a family again. Right, I murmured. And this has nothing to do with money? Her eyes widened, the perfect image of wounded innocence. Laura, no, Mom, I cut in, my voice firm. Let's be honest here. Dad worked himself to death supporting you and Sarah. Neither of you ever considered getting jobs to help. And now he's gone. You suddenly want me back in your life, and I'm supposed to believe it's not because you need financial help? Silence. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, stirring her tea without looking at me. Mom bit her lip, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. We do need help, she admitted finally, her voice small. But that's not why It's exactly why, I interrupted. You had years to care about me, years to be a mother to me, but you didn't. And now that Dad's gone, now that there's no one to support you, I'm suddenly important? Mom's face crumpled, and for a second, I almost felt guilty. But then I remembered every time she ignored me, every time she pushed me aside for Sarah, every time Dad had to sneak away just to see me. She swallowed. I don't know what to do, Laura. The bills, the mortgage. Get a job, I said flatly. Both of you. Sarah's head snapped up. That's not fair, she said, her voice sharp. We just lost Dad. And he spent his entire life working to make sure you two didn't have to lift a finger. I shot back. If you think I'm going to step in and take his place, you're wrong. Mom let out a soft sob, her shoulders shaking. Laura, please. I don't expect you to take care of us. I just thought maybe we could start over. Maybe you could be part of this family again. I stared at her, at Sarah, at the kitchen that once felt like home but now felt foreign. Being part of this family never meant anything good for me, I said quietly. It meant being ignored. It meant being second place. The only person who ever made me feel like I mattered is gone. I pushed back my chair and stood. I came here because I thought maybe, just maybe, you actually cared about me. But I see now that you're just desperate, and I won't be your safety net. Mom's sobs grew louder. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Maybe she knew I was right. Maybe for once, she didn't have a response. I turned and walked toward the door, my heartbeat steady. Just as I reached it, Mom's voice stopped me. Laura, she whispered, I know I failed you, and I know I don't deserve your help, but I am still your mother, and I do love you. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. Then, without looking back, I opened the door and walked out. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside, but I welcomed it. I had spent my whole life chasing after their love, waiting for them to see me. But now, for the first time, I realized something. I didn't need them to. The walk back to my car felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort through. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sound of my mother's sobs, but they still echoed in my mind. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly as I tried to breathe through the storm inside me. I had waited years for her to acknowledge what she had done, for Sarah to admit her part in it. And now that the moment had come, it felt hollow. Too little. Too late. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. For a brief second, I thought it would be Sarah again, trying a different approach. But when I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number stared back at me. I hesitated before answering. Hello? Is this Laura Peterson? The voice was male, professional. Yes, who is this? My name is Mark Reynolds. I'm an attorney handling your father's estate. I've been trying to get in touch with you. My grip tightened. Why? There are matters regarding his will that require your attention. Would you be able to come by my office sometime this week? My pulse quickened. I wasn't aware there was anything for me to handle. I assumed my mother... Your father made some specific arrangements before his passing, Mark interrupted gently. It's important that we go over them with you directly. I swallowed hard, nodding even though he couldn't see me. Okay, when can I come in? Tomorrow morning at 10? I'll be there. We exchanged a few more details before hanging up, and I sat there staring at the black screen. Dad had left something for me. The thought filled me with a strange mix of sadness and anticipation. He had always been the only one who saw me, who acknowledged me, and even in death, it seemed he hadn't forgotten. The next morning, I arrived at the law office, my nerves thrumming under my skin as I stepped inside. Mark Reynolds was a middle-aged man with sharp but kind eyes, his suit crisp and professional. He gestured for me to sit as he sorted through a stack of documents. Your father was a meticulous man, he began, offering a small smile. He made sure everything was in order long before his passing. I nodded, waiting. He left the house to your mother and sister, Mark continued, along with a portion of his savings. But he also left something specifically for you. My breath caught. What? Mark slid a folder across the desk. Your father had a separate account. Over the years, he put aside a significant amount of money for you. He wanted to make sure you had something of your own, no matter what. My hands trembled as I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the numbers. It wasn't an earth-shattering fortune, but it was enough. Enough to do something meaningful. Enough to be free. He also left a letter, Mark added, passing me an envelope. My throat tightened as I took it. The handwriting was unmistakably Dad's. "I'll give you a moment," Mark said, standing and stepping out of the office. My fingers shook as I opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. "Laura, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I wish I had more time. But life doesn't always give us what we want. What I want you to know, more than anything, is that I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. You built your life on your own terms, and I admire you for that. I know things were never easy in our home. I know your mother and Sarah didn't always see you the way they should have. I tried to be there for you as much as I could, but I regret not doing more. This money isn't much, but it's something. Something that belongs only to you. Do with it whatever makes you happy. Build the life you deserve, and never ever doubt how much I love you." Tears blurred the ink as I stared at the words, my father's voice echoing in my head. He had known. He had always known. He had seen me when no one else had, and even in death, he had chosen me. I pressed the letter to my chest, breathing through the ache in my heart. He was gone, but this, his love, his belief in me, was something no one could ever take away. I sat in my car outside the law office, the letter still clutched in my hands, my father's words etched into my mind like an unshakable truth. He had seen me, he had known everything, and even now, he had given me something my mother and Sarah never had: acknowledgement. I wiped at my damp cheeks, folding the letter carefully before placing it back in the envelope. The weight of it felt heavier than the paper itself, like it carried years of unspoken words, of quiet sacrifices I had never fully understood. I took a deep breath and started the car, my mind racing with possibilities. My first instinct was to go home, lock the door, and let everything sink in, but something inside me urged me to drive somewhere else. Before I knew it, I was parked outside my mother's house again. I wasn't sure why I had come. Maybe part of me wanted to see if she knew about this, if she had suspected Dad had left me something. Maybe I just wanted to look at the house one last time and remind myself that I wasn't trapped by it anymore. I stepped out. The air colder today, the sky overcast. The house looked the same, but for the first time, I saw it differently. Not as something I had left behind, but as something that had never truly belonged to me in the first place. I knocked, and it didn't take long before Sarah opened the door. She looked surprised, but her eyes immediately flicked downward, scanning me, searching for something. I could already feel the shift. She knew. "You came back," she said cautiously. "Yeah," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Where's Mom?" "In the kitchen," she said, shutting the door behind me. I walked through the house, my fingers brushing against the walls as I passed, feeling the worn familiarity of a place that had never quite felt like home. When I entered the kitchen, Mom was at the table, a cup of coffee in front of her. Dark circles under her eyes. She looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Relief? Guilt? It was hard to tell. "Laura," she said, her voice cautious. "I wasn't expecting you." "Did you know?" I asked, my voice steady. "Know what?" Her fingers tightened around the mug, her nails digging into the ceramic. "That Dad left me something. That he made sure I had something of my own." I watched her closely, waiting for the mask to slip. Her lips pressed together, and I saw the moment she decided to lie. "No," she said too quickly. I didn't. I let out a breath through my nose, shaking my head. "Don't bother, Mom. I can tell when you're lying." Sarah stepped into the kitchen behind me, arms crossed, watching the conversation unfold like a spectator at a show. "So what did he leave you?" she asked, her voice neutral. But I could feel the tension underneath it. "Enough," I said, not giving her specifics. "Enough to make sure I never have to rely on anyone else. Enough that I don't have to be trapped by this house or by you." Mom swallowed hard. "Laura, that's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you only wanted me back in your life when you thought you could use me. But now that you know I have something Dad left for me, you're panicking." "That's not true," she insisted, but there was something desperate in her voice now. "We just wanted to fix things." "No," I said firmly. "You wanted security. You wanted to make sure I'd take care of you. That's not the same as wanting me." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Look," she said, trying for a casual tone. "Maybe we can work something out. Maybe you can help us out a little, just until we figure things out." I turned to her slowly, staring. "Help you? Like Dad did? Like I'm supposed to just step into his shoes and make sure you're both comfortable while I work myself into exhaustion?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I mean, it's not like you're struggling, right?" Something inside me snapped. A cold, final clarity settled over me. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "Dad died working himself into the ground for you. He spent his whole life making sure you never had to lift a finger. And now that he's gone, you just expect someone else to pick up the slack. But I'm not him, and I never will be." Mom let out a shaky breath, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Laura, please, we're family." "No," I said, and this time, it wasn't anger or pain speaking. It was certainty. "You were never my family. Dad was my family, and now he's gone." I stepped back, shaking my head as I looked at them one last time. "I'm done." And with that, I turned and walked away. This time, I didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess myself. I left, shutting the door behind me, sealing off the past I had spent too long trying to fix. I got into my car, my father's letter sitting on the seat beside me, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. I drove for hours without a destination, the city's streets blurring into endless streaks of headlights and neon reflections on wet pavement. The weight of everything pressed down on me. The confrontation, the realization, the finality of it all. I had always known deep down that my mother and Sarah saw me as nothing more than a backup plan, but hearing it so plainly, seeing their desperation so nakedly exposed, had left a bitterness in my mouth that I couldn't wash away. Dad had spent his entire life as their safety net, and they had expected me to take his place without hesitation. But I wasn't him, and I never would be. The letter sat beside me on the passenger seat, his words etched into my mind like an unshakable truth. He had seen me. He had known. And even in death, he had chosen to free me. I pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, needing a moment to think. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting a soft, humming glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, the place was nearly empty, the scent of coffee and fried food thick in the air. I slid into a booth near the window, staring at the rain that had started to drizzle against the glass. A waitress approached, her tired smile genuine. "What can I get you, hun?" "Coffee," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Black." She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. Everything felt surreal, like I was floating just outside of my own life, watching it unfold from a distance. For years, I had worked tirelessly to build something for myself, to carve out a life that was my own, separate from them. And yet, in the span of a few days, I had been dragged right back into their orbit. But not anymore. The door to the diner chimed as someone else entered, and I barely glanced up until I heard a familiar voice. "Laura?" I stiffened. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart sinking as I recognized him. Michael Carter, my father's closest friend and co-worker. He was older than Dad had been, maybe in his early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He had always been kind to me, always treated me like I mattered when I was younger. Seeing him now, after everything, was almost too much. "Michael," I said, my voice tight. "I didn't expect to see you here." He offered a small, sad smile. "Didn't expect to see you either." He slid into the booth across from me without asking, folding his hands together on the table. "I heard about the will," he said after a moment. I tensed. "Did my mother send you?" His brow furrowed. "No. She doesn't even know I'm here." "Then why?" He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Because I think you need to know the full truth about your father." My stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down in front of me. I barely noticed as she walked away. Michael leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Laura, your father didn't just put money aside for you because he wanted to make sure you had something of your own. He did it because he was planning to leave." My breath caught. "What?" He nodded. "He told me about it a few months before he passed. Said he couldn't do it anymore. The double shifts, the financial strain, the way they treated him like he was just expected to keep going until he broke. He wanted out. He was saving up, planning to retire early, move somewhere quieter. He wanted you to come with him. My heart pounded violently in my chest. That's not possible. He never said, because he didn't want to burden you. Michael interrupted gently. He knew you were building your own life, and he didn't want to pull you into his problems. But he was going to tell you, eventually. He just ran out of time. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I couldn't feel anything anymore. My father had been planning to escape. He had been planning to start over, and he had wanted me to go with him. I don't understand, I whispered. Why didn't he just leave? Why didn't he tell me sooner? Michael sighed heavily. Because he was afraid. Afraid of what would happen to them if he walked away. He had spent so many years holding everything together that he didn't know how to let go. And then, well, his body made the decision for him. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The weight in my chest was suffocating. All this time, I had thought Dad had stayed because he wanted to, because he couldn't imagine leaving them behind. But that wasn't true at all. He had wanted out just as much as I had. And now, I was the only one left who could still make that choice. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. He left this in his locker at work. I found it after everything. I think he meant to give it to you. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. My father's familiar handwriting scrawled across the front. Laura. I swallowed hard, my vision blurring as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged in places, like he had hesitated while writing. Laura, by the time you read this, I hope we're sitting somewhere peaceful, just the two of us, talking about everything we missed. But if I didn't make it that far, I need you to know something. I always wanted more for you. More than this life, more than the expectations they put on you. You've always been strong, but you don't have to carry everything alone. I wanted to leave, to start over, to find happiness in a way I never had before. And I wanted you to have that choice too. If I'm gone, promise me you won't let them pull you back in. Promise me you'll live the life you deserve. I love you. Always. The words blurred as tears slipped down my cheeks, silent and unstoppable. He had known. He had wanted me to be free. And now, it was up to me to make sure his sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it against my chest as I exhaled shakily. Michael watched me with quiet understanding, his expression heavy with sympathy. So, he said after a long moment, what are you going to do now? I wiped my face, my hands steadying as I placed the letter back in its envelope, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was going to leave. Not just my mother's house, not just the city, but everything. I was going to start over, just like Dad had wanted. And this time, nothing was going to stop me. I drove through the city with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My father's letter resting safely in my bag, his words still echoing in my mind. Promise me you'll live the life you deserve. It was strange how something so simple, so heartfelt could shake the foundation of everything I thought I knew. For so long, I had believed I was running away from my past. But in truth, I had still been tethered to it, carrying its weight even when I thought I had escaped. Now, with every mile I put between myself and my mother's house, I felt those invisible chains loosening. I didn't go home. Instead, I found myself driving to my father's workplace, the factory where he had spent years breaking his back to keep my mother and Sarah comfortable. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time I arrived, the dull glow of security lights casting long shadows across the pavement. I wasn't sure why I was here. Maybe I just needed to see it one last time, to understand the place that had stolen him from me. The air was thick with the scent of metal and oil, a sharp contrast to the memories I had of him. I remembered the exhaustion in his voice during our late-night phone calls, the way he tried to sound cheerful even when I could hear the weariness beneath his words. He had never complained, never let me see just how much the job had taken from him. And yet, here I was, standing outside the place that had drained the life out of him. I clenched my fists, an overwhelming wave of anger surging through me. He had deserved better. He had deserved more than this. A flicker of movement caught my attention near the entrance, and I turned to see Michael stepping outside, locking up for the night. He noticed me almost immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, almost expectant. Couldn't sleep? He asked, pocketing his keys as he approached. Not really, I admitted. I don't know why I came here. He nodded, as if he understood without me having to explain. Sometimes you need to face the things that hurt before you can let them go. I looked up at the building again, my chest tightening. He spent his whole life here, I murmured, giving everything he had until there was nothing left. Michael sighed, crossing his arms. Yeah, he did, and it wasn't fair. I turned to him, searching his face. Did he ever talk about it? About how much he hated this place? Michael hesitated before answering. He didn't hate it, not exactly. He hated what it took from him. But he stayed because he thought he had to. For them. The bitterness in my throat burned. And they didn't even appreciate it. Michael studied me for a long moment before speaking again. You're not him, Laura. You don't have to make the same choices. I exhaled slowly, nodding. I know. And I did. For the first time, I truly did. He had stayed out of obligation, out of a sense of responsibility that had ultimately cost him everything. But I wasn't going to make that mistake. I was going to choose myself. I'm leaving, I said suddenly, the words solidifying into reality as they left my lips. Not just the city, everything. I don't know where yet, but I need to get away from all of this. Michael didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. Your dad would want that for you. I glanced at the factory one last time, memorizing the way it stood against the night sky, a symbol of everything I was walking away from. Then, without another word, I turned and headed back to my car. The drive home was quiet, the streets nearly empty. When I finally stepped into my apartment, it felt different somehow, like it was no longer just a place I lived, but a temporary stop before something bigger. I spent the next few days making plans, researching places I could go, opportunities that would allow me to start over. I emptied my apartment little by little, donating things I no longer needed, packing only the essentials. I even put in my resignation at work, much to the shock of my boss. But the most difficult step came when I finally sat down to write a letter to my mother and Sarah. Not because I owed them an explanation, but because I needed to say goodbye on my own terms. Mom, Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I don't expect you to understand, but I need you to know that this isn't about revenge or anger. It's about freedom. For years, I let myself believe that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself enough, you would see me the way Dad did. But I realize now that I was chasing something that never existed. You never saw me, not really. And that's okay, because I see myself now. And I refuse to be trapped by expectations that were never meant for me. Dad spent his whole life sacrificing for you, and in the end, it cost him everything. I won't let it cost me too. So I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing to live. To really live. I hope, one day, you understand what that means. Goodbye. I sealed the letter and left it on the counter before walking out of the apartment for the last time. I didn't look back. At the airport, as I waited for my flight to board, I unfolded my father's letter one last time, tracing my fingers over the ink, over the words he had left for me. Promise me you'll live the life you deserve. I smiled faintly, tucking the letter safely away. I will, Dad, I promise. And as the plane took off, carrying me toward the unknown, I finally felt it. The weight lifting, the past fading behind me, the future stretching out before me, wide and limitless. I was free. The air felt different in this new place, lighter, unburdened by the ghosts of my past. I had landed in a city where no one knew my name, where I was just another face in the crowd. And for the first time in my life, that anonymity felt like freedom. I found a small apartment. Nothing extravagant, just enough space for me to exist without feeling weighed down by excess. I took a job at a bookstore, something simple, something that didn't consume me. My days were quiet, filled with the scent of paper and ink, and for a while, that was enough. But the past is never truly silent, and ghosts never stay buried for long. It started with a voicemail. My phone buzzed late one evening as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars. I hesitated before playing the message, my mother's voice cracking through the speaker like a blade against stone. Laura, it's Sarah. She's gone. The words didn't register at first, their meaning floating just beyond my grasp. Gone? The sister who had taken everything, who had always been at the center of our mother's world? I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as my mother continued, her sobs punctuating every sentence. It was an accident. She was drinking, driving too fast. The car flipped. She didn't make it. My stomach twisted violently, my fingers digging into the metal railing as I tried to breathe through the sudden weight crushing my chest. Sarah was dead. The sister I had resented, envied, despised in quiet moments of weakness. The sister who had always been given everything I had to fight for. Gone, just like that. I should have felt something. Grief, anger, regret. But all I felt was numbness, a hollow space where emotions should have been. My mother's voice broke through the static in my mind. Please, come home. I can't do this alone. Home. A word that had lost all meaning to me. I hadn't looked back since leaving, hadn't checked in, hadn't wondered how they were getting by without my father's steady sacrifice. But now, with Sarah gone, the balance had shifted. My mother was truly alone, and despite everything, some part of me still felt tethered to the wreckage of my old life. I booked the next flight out. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its walls seeming to lean inward as if collapsing under the weight of grief. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her face gaunt, her eyes sunken into dark hollows. She looked older, as if the years had finally caught up to her in a single devastating moment. "Laura," she whispered, reaching for me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. She stepped aside, letting me in, and the air inside the house was thick with stale perfume and something rotten lurking beneath the surface. The funeral had already passed. I hadn't asked why she hadn't waited for me, and she hadn't offered an explanation. Instead, she led me to Sarah's old room, untouched, frozen in time. Dresses still hung neatly in the closet, makeup scattered across the vanity, a half-finished cup of coffee molding on the bedside table. As if she had just stepped out and would be back any minute. But she wouldn't. She was struggling, my mother murmured, standing in the doorway. She didn't tell me how bad it was, the drinking, the debt. She was drowning, and I didn't see it until it was too late. I stared at the bed, the perfectly arranged pillows, the illusion of a life still in motion. "And now?" I asked, my voice quiet, detached. My mother exhaled shakily. "Now I have nothing." The words cut through me, sharp and cold. I turned to face her, searching for something. Remorse, self-awareness, even just a flicker of understanding. But all I saw was emptiness, because I had never been part of the equation. I had never been enough. Even now, standing in the wreckage, she still didn't see me. "I should have died instead," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It should have been me." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. That night, I lay in my old bed, the ceiling staring back at me, suffocating in its familiarity. I thought about my father, about how he had spent his entire life giving to people who only knew how to take, about how he had wanted to leave but never did. And I realized then that my mother would never change. Even with Sarah gone, she would always be reaching for someone to fill the void, to carry the weight she refused to bear herself. And I would not be that person. The next morning, I packed my bag, moving quietly through the house, my presence barely a whisper. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of untouched tea. She didn't look up as I approached. "I'm leaving," I said simply. She flinched as if the words had struck her. "Again?" I didn't respond. There was no point. I reached into my bag, pulling out my father's letter, the one I had carried with me since the day I left. I placed it gently on the table beside her tea. "You should read this," I said, my voice softer now. "Maybe then you'll understand." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, and I knew she never would. I turned and walked out the door, the morning sun blinding as I stepped into the light. The weight in my chest was still there, but it felt different now. Lighter. Something I could carry without it dragging me down. As I got into the taxi, I glanced back at the house one last time. A house full of ghosts. But I wasn't one of them. Not anymore.